Story 1. Life here has always been measured, calm. I lived in one of the most beautiful corners of northeastern India, among hills surrounded by greenery. Often, especially in the evenings, the fog would wrap around the treetops, as if sliding over them like a light fabric, and the world would become silent and almost mystical. Here in these mountains, I felt like I was in a secluded corner of the world, where all processes went slowly and smoothly, and nothing disturbed the usual harmony. I was the middle child in the family. Mom, dad, older brother, and younger sister, whom everyone called M. We always lived in a house on the outskirts of the city, and I was used to solitude. My brother was 5 years older than me, and I always felt like he knew more about life than I did, maybe even more than he should. Enam, my younger sister, was almost the opposite. She was lively, energetic, always with a smile on her face, and a bunch of ideas in her head. We always managed to have a great time together. I remember how she often told me about her new hobbies, dreams, and plans. But that night was different. M had just graduated from high school. It was a big moment for her, the final stage of her life as a student. Her class had thrown a farewell dinner with the class teacher to celebrate the end of the school year. M was in a good mood, and even though I was absorbed in my studies, I knew that this event was significant for her. She often talked about how excited she was about the future, how she would miss school, her friends, but that night she needed something else. I don't know what exactly, but definitely something more than just an evening meal. I was sitting in my room surrounded by books. The college semester was coming to an end, and I had exams to prepare for. I spent most of the evening alone, studying and solving problems, absorbed in something important that required my full attention. Everything that happened outside my room seemed insignificant. I heard my sister go to dinner. I heard my brother's footsteps on his way to church, but these were just backgrounds in my life. Sometimes I would lose myself in thought, imagining a world beyond the study materials, but then I would force myself to return to my books. Time flew by, and when the clock showed 9:40 p.m., my phone suddenly rang. It was a call from M. I remembered that dinner was about to end, and that she might need someone to pick her up. Dad was at work, and my brother was at church. I asked where she was, and she gave me an address. It was unfamiliar to me, and that immediately aroused my curiosity. I didn't know what kind of place she was telling me, but it didn't matter. She had called, and I had to help. I stood up immediately, grabbed my bike keys, and rode out. At first, I was relieved to be able to take a break from the books, but the road I was about to take gave me a vague sense of unease. The city quickly left me behind, and I found myself deep in dark, winding streets I had never seen before. I tried to follow the navigation, but the place felt alien. There were no streetlights, no signs, nothing to indicate people or life around. I passed houses that looked abandoned. This was not typical for our neighborhood. I was used to everything being quiet here among the hills, but at this moment the place felt eerily empty. At first I thought it was just some kind of temporary power outage, but as I went deeper into the darkness, my thoughts became more and more restless. The area seemed torn out of time and space. When I finally reached my destination, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. It wasn't a restaurant, a cafe, or a house, but a barn on the side of the road. As strange as it may sound, that's where M was standing, waiting for me. It looked like she'd just appeared out of the shadows with no signs of life around her. She was alone and didn't say a word to me as I pulled up. I walked up to her and she silently sat on my bike, as if nothing had happened. Usually she was lively, bright, always talking, sharing her impressions, but now, only silence. We started walking back home. It was late and I felt that the way back would be long. But on the road at one of the turns, I met a friend standing on the side of the road. We chatted for a while, and I told him that I had just picked up my sister. He said that everything was fine, but his expression was strange, as if I had said something ridiculous. We continued on our way, and that's where things got really weird. On a familiar street, I suddenly noticed that the bike had become heavy. I didn't hear M get on the seat behind me, and when I stopped at the garage, I turned around. There was no one behind me. M was gone. She wasn't just gone. She was gone. I looked carefully at the back seat, the driveway, but there was no one there. No sound, no movement. My heart started beating faster as I turned around again and again, trying to figure out what was going on. I went into the house, but my brother was already inside. I asked him if M was there, but he didn't know what I was talking about. Only then did it dawn on me that something incredible had happened. That evening turned everything I knew about the world upside down. When I saw that M was gone, and in her place there was only silence at home, I found it hard to believe what was happening. But the realization came quickly. Something was wrong. How many times had I turned around to check and then looked back at the empty street as if expecting to see her, or at least hear her voice? But no, nothing. Silence. A deathly silence that covered everything around. She was gone, as simple as if she had never been there. I hurried into the house, feeling panic rising within me. My brother was sitting at the table in his room, apparently oblivious to anything strange. I forced myself to go up to him and ask, "Is she home yet?" He looked at me in bewilderment. "No, she's not home. Her friend's father just called and said he'd take her himself." That was the moment when I felt everything fall into place, or rather, how everything fell apart. I couldn't understand how this was possible. I had seen her. I had just picked her up from that barn sitting behind me. I hadn't even noticed that she was gone. It seemed so absurd that it was beyond my comprehension. How could this even be possible? My brother was already in his room when I quickly ran to mine, trying to figure out what was going on. I grabbed my phone and started searching through the call history for the exact moment M called me. As if trying to regain control of the situation, I found that call. It was there, right there on the screen. The time, the date, everything was as usual. But how was that possible? I was absolutely sure that she had called me from that place. Suddenly, a question appeared in front of me that made me freeze. What if the one I took wasn't there? That was my first thought. My brain was trying hard to find an explanation. My gaze slid over the screens of the devices, over what I had just seen, but nothing could give me an answer. My mind was rushing to those same strange images from what had happened, but everything seemed so absurd that I wanted to think that it was all just a figment of my imagination. How could this be? The thought didn't leave me, but I was too confused to continue thinking. At that moment, the door opened and M walked into the room. I looked at her, stunned. She couldn't be here. She had just been in that shed. But there she was, standing in front of me, with a small smile on her face, the same as always. Before I could even ask her a question, she had already started telling me something about how she had lost her phone on the way, how she couldn't find it after dinner. It was all too strange. She didn't remember anything about the call, just like she didn't remember me picking her up from that place. All she said was, "I lost my phone on the way," and her face remained completely casual. I couldn't believe what was happening. I tried to understand how this was possible. I clearly remembered that she was with me, sitting behind me on the bike. But her words, her innocent face, all of this made me doubt the reality of what was happening. It was as if I found myself in some kind of nightmare, in which I could not understand where the line between reality and fiction was. I looked at her phone again, and this time I noticed that something was wrong. At first I thought it was an insignificant detail, but now it became clearly noticeable to me. I felt a strange, heavy object in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and froze. It was M's phone. But how did it end up in my pocket? I was sure she had lost it, and now it was lying in my hand, as if it had come to me on its own. She asked me how I got it, and I told her everything as it happened. But I was even more struck by the moment when she mentioned that dinner again. She said that they had dined in a resort area outside the city, in the place where she had lost her phone. But I had been with her in another place, not at all like a resort. This place was abandoned, forgotten, as if time had ceased to exist here. How could that be? Then I called my friend, whom I had met that evening. I wanted to know if he had noticed anything strange. We talked for a while, and I asked him if he remembered meeting me. He confirmed that he had seen me, but said that M was not there. He was sure of it because he had been a bit confused when I said I would take her. I was alone. Alone! Everything fell into place. It was true, I had not taken my sister. The one I had seen was not there. The person I had been talking to was not M. Someone else. Someone who knew exactly how to deceive me. How was this possible? How could I have been so wrong? And now I was faced with a reality in which no one could help me. I was alone in this situation, alone with my head spinning, trying to find some kind of explanation. But the more I thought, the more I couldn't find anything logical. My sister was still at home, but I didn't know who or what I took that night. The next morning I woke up with a heavy feeling, as if I had lived through some kind of nightmare. Everything that had happened yesterday was spinning around in my head, giving me no peace. Time seemed to fly by in an instant, and here I was again in my room, but the sensation still did not leave me. I tried to find an explanation for all this, but I could not. It seemed that reality was crumbling more and more like sand, and I could not do anything about it. Everything around seemed alien and wrong. I decided to go back to that place, to go back and see everything with my own eyes without emotions and doubts, to try to understand what had happened. My brother was skeptical about this, but he still offered to help me so that I would not be alone. We decided to go there together. I did not know what we would find, but I felt that it was necessary. One way or another, I needed to make sure that all this was not a figment of my imagination. As we drove out, I noticed how the roads around us were becoming more and more familiar. We were heading towards the area I had visited the day before. It was early morning, and everything looked different, much more peaceful and ordinary. The roads were brighter, the sun was shining on everything. But as we approached the place, I felt a strange tension in the air. The same area where I had picked up M was no longer the same as the one I had seen last night. There were no houses, abandoned or not, no trace of the place I remembered so clearly. Everything seemed empty, as if someone had wiped away all traces. I looked around trying to find anything that would remind me of that night, but everything was different. The ground was open, a few trees were buried, and nothing else. There was no barn, no buildings. This place did not exist. I looked at my brother. He looked as confused as I did. "Are you sure this is the right place?" he asked. I nodded, pointing to the road I was on. There was no doubt about it. This place was definitely there. We had both feet on the ground, but something in the air told me that we were in some non-existent space. It was as if I had entered a world that had no right to exist. My brother looked around again, but finding nothing, he got back into the car. I too was lost in thought, peering into the void, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just been in some parallel dimension. With each step, I realized that I didn't have an answer to the questions that tormented me. Something was confusing me. After a few minutes of silence, I finally spoke. "I never thought it would be so hard to find a place I remember," I said. He just shrugged and quietly replied, "You must have gotten something wrong." But what could I say to that? My memory was so vivid and clear, and all I could see now was empty space. We decided to go home. On the way, I thought again about what happened yesterday, about M, about that call, about me picking her up and then her disappearance, about me standing in the garage in an empty house when she was gone. And even the fact that I took off my jacket and found her phone in my pocket only added to the strangeness of the story. I didn't know what it meant, because even if she herself had lost it, how could I have it? When we got home, I felt even more confused. I should have calmed down, but the feeling of anxiety wouldn't leave me. Everything around me was the same as before. M was at home with her friend. Everything was as usual. But now even her presence seemed alien. I couldn't shake the feeling that the M I took that night was not her, and it all started so real. Everything that happened was real, and at the same time it wasn't. Everything I experienced seemed different, as if it wasn't my reality. I didn't tell M about it. She wouldn't understand. But what's worse, I was haunted by the question. If I wasn't mistaken, who was with me that night? Who or what was it I took from that barn? And why was everything as I hadn't expected? The next day, I decided to try to find information about the place where I had been. I sat down at the computer, started searching the internet, but I couldn't find anything. Local forums didn't talk about abandoned houses. There were no traces. Even search engines didn't give any mention of the area I had visited. And the more I searched, the more I felt like someone was simply deceiving me. But who? What if the world I had seen was part of something more dangerous than I could imagine? The next morning, I woke up with a feeling of unease that wouldn't leave me even in the quiet of my house. It was something strange, almost physical, as if something invisible was constantly watching me. I wanted to believe that all of this was just my imagination, the result of fatigue, but my mind told me otherwise. It was too real. I felt that moment again when M disappeared, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something. I thought that maybe I should talk to M, but she was the same as always, the same, normal. At the breakfast table, she was smiling and talking to her brother, but I couldn't help but notice something strange in her eyes. There was some kind of emptiness, the same emptiness I felt that night. It's impossible to explain in words, but I knew that something was wrong. She was with us, but at the same time, it was as if she wasn't there. I couldn't understand it. I made the decision to go there again, to that place. Maybe if I found myself in that area again, I would find answers. But what bothered me most was that I didn't remember how exactly I left. The night. The barn. It was all a fog in my head. And the more I tried to reconstruct the events, the more I felt reality slipping away. It all made no sense. This time, I went alone. I told Em I was going for a walk, and she didn't object. My brother was on his computer, absorbed in games, and didn't notice when I left. I left the house and headed toward the area that night, was something I could call familiar. With every step I took, my heart began to beat faster. It seemed as if I was walking down the same path again, but now everything was completely different. The road seemed longer, and the streets were emptier. I felt everything changing, as if this world I was walking through was beginning to crumble, like a sand castle when the rain washes away its details. Where was that barn? Where was that place I remembered? Not a single trace. Everything seemed empty, unreal, and like last time, I could find nothing that would explain what was happening. I walked down the street and felt the wind on my skin, but even that didn't feel the same. It was too quiet, almost ominous. A fear washed over me that I couldn't explain. And then I stopped. There was an empty space ahead, just like then. But now I knew for sure that something was wrong. I felt it in my whole body. I couldn't explain how, but I knew that here, in this place, were the answers waiting for me. I looked around and noticed a small trail, barely noticeable. It was barely visible, but I recognized the mark immediately. It was a trail left by someone or something. I began to follow it, and soon I found myself in the very place where it all seemed to begin. It was the same corner, the same patch of ground where I had seen her, but now there was nothing there, just dirt and dead grass. It was as if the trail had been made specifically to lead me here, and yet, as I looked around, it became clear to me. There was no barn, no buildings, no anything I expected to find. There was only silence. I kept walking until I saw something strange. There was a broken stick lying on the ground, just like the ones used in the barn. I walked over and picked it up. Strange. It was the first thing I had found that felt familiar. But why? Why this stick? It shouldn't be there. It was part of a world that was gone. The feeling came over me with renewed force. Something that was real and something that shouldn't have been were now intersecting. I decided to explore further. With every step I took, the feeling of losing control grew stronger. The deeper I went into this place, the more it began to resemble something else. It was like a nightmare where you realize that everything is not what it seems, but you can't wake up. I began to feel like at any moment I could encounter something terrible, something that could not exist in normal reality. As I turned to leave, Em appeared before me again, but she was not the one I knew. This was not the person I lived with. She stood a few meters away from me, her face covered in a strange, unnatural shadow. She looked at me, and there was nothing human in her eyes. Silent, wordless, she just stood there. I did not know how to react. Suddenly, she took a step forward, and at that moment I felt everything around me spinning. My head filled with strange sounds, and I felt the ground beneath my feet become unstable. I wanted to run, but something held me in place. I tried to remember what had happened, but my memory seemed to be torn apart, as if trying to hide what had happened before. With each passing moment, she became more and more a part of this world. There was nothing alive in her eyes. And then I realized that something had happened to Em. But what? Why was she here? Why did I continue to see her when she had already disappeared? I forced myself to turn and run, and at the moment when I started to leave, I looked back, and she was gone. Only emptiness remained, the same as in the beginning. I couldn't forget that meeting. Everything that happened at that moment seemed to leave an imprint on me that couldn't be washed away. When I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just leaving a strange place, but also losing something. That moment with Em haunted me. I knew I had to find an explanation for what had happened, but the more I tried to understand, the less clear everything became. I got home and decided I needed some time to get my bearings. Em was home, sitting on the couch like usual, but she seemed a little distant, as if she hadn't been there for a moment. Everything around her seemed normal, but I was becoming more and more lost in my thoughts. I tried to talk to her, but the words didn't seem to reach me. I tried to focus on what she was saying, but this empty feeling kept haunting me. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I decided to talk to my brother. He was still sitting at the computer, but I noticed that his gaze was not as clear as usual. I couldn't help but notice that something was happening to him too. He was wary, as if something was bothering him. He was trying to hide something, but I couldn't figure out what. I walked up to him and asked, "Have you noticed anything strange? Is something wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He glanced at me, and I felt the tension between us grow. I don't know. It's all weird. Sometimes I feel like I missed something. Something happened, but I can't remember what it was." His words just didn't make sense to me. I tried to figure out what he meant, but I felt like my thoughts were blurring like smoke. I couldn't focus. I looked at him and felt a distance growing between us, like we were both in this place full of fog and couldn't get out. I decided to go out again. Maybe it would help me somehow collect myself and calm down. I went outside and walked along familiar paths, trying to find something that would help me restore a normal perception of the world. This place, this city, was what I knew. But now everything was different. People walked by, but their faces were not clear, as if I was behind glass, separated from them. A foggy curtain hung everywhere. I went outside the city into the forest, where my brother and I used to often walk. I needed to find something familiar, to at least slightly return a sense of normality. Walking along the path, I saw an old toy on the ground. It was a small wooden teddy bear. The moment I saw it, a thought struck me. It was somehow familiar, as if I had seen it before. But where? Why did this toy suddenly appear here? I picked it up from the ground, trying to remember where it could have come from. And then that same scene came back to me. The night, her disappearance, that phone I found in my pocket. I couldn't shake the thought that it was all connected somehow. I continued walking, and looking around, I saw that the forest around me seemed a little less alive. This place was familiar, but at the same time it began to change. I felt the ground beneath my feet becoming softer, and the trees seemed more curved, as if they were starting to lose their shape. I noticed how a bush standing by the path began to move. I came closer, and at that very second everything around became darker, as if night had fallen. I froze, trying to understand what was happening. At that moment, a wave of memories crashed over me. How I tried to find answers. How I stood in that empty place and saw Em at that moment when she was not there. And now I was here again, on the edge of reality and something supernatural. I threw the toy on the ground and took a step back. And then, in the shadow of the trees, I saw her again, Em. She stood in front of me. Her face was as empty and lifeless as that time. But now her eyes were different. It was not just the absence of life, it was a cold that I found difficult to bear. She did not speak. She just stood, her eyes never leaving mine. I was too afraid to move. I just looked at her and felt her presence fill the space around me. Everything was silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I couldn't tear my eyes away from hers, which now seemed not just empty, but full of something dark, something I couldn't understand. She took a slow step forward, and I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to crumble. With every move she made, the world around me changed. Everything became unstable. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. Everything inside me seemed to freeze. And then I realized that none of this was a coincidence. I hadn't been wrong. Em was not who I knew. This was not the person who had once been next to me. This was something else. But what? What had happened to her? I took a step back, but she continued to move towards me. And in that moment, the world around me disappeared. I woke up in my house, but the feeling that everything was wrong did not leave me. Everything looked normal, but there was a void in my mind that I could not fill. Yesterday's meeting with Em in the forest haunted me, and I could not shake this feeling that I had lost something important. But what exactly? What happened in that moment when I lost control? Why was I sure that she was not who I knew? These questions haunted me, and the answers did not come. I remembered her eyes, empty, cold, soulless. It wasn't just a meeting with a missing part of her. It was something more terrifying, something that was connected to something I couldn't understand. I felt like I was on the verge of a discovery, but I remained in complete darkness. All these strange events, the night visits, the disappearances, the mysterious tracks, couldn't be a coincidence. I kept returning to the moment when it all began. I couldn't sit and wait for the answers to come to me. I decided to go back to the forest. Maybe I missed something. Maybe something remained that would help me understand what was happening. I took my backpack and left the house. Em did not notice my departure. She was absorbed in her own affairs just as always. This gave me time to conduct my own search. I walked along familiar paths again, but the forest now seemed different. It was darker, quieter, as if the world itself was drawn into this vortex of unknown dark forces. I reached the very place where I met Monsieur the last time. Everything here was as I remembered, empty, cold, unnatural. But now I understood that this forest was not just a place, it was part of something much larger. I approached the bush near which I lost consciousness and noticed that the ground here was disturbed, as if someone or something had passed through it, leaving traces that I had not noticed before. I began to dig, but the earth was too hard, and I could not find anything. But at that moment I felt my hands touch something hard. I pulled it out, and in my hands was an old amulet, covered in dust and dirt. It was the amulet I had seen many years ago, in Em's hands, when we first met. I didn't know she had it, but I knew that this amulet was part of what was happening now. I remembered how she often wore it, as if it were her talisman, something that helped her cope with something. But there was something else connected to this amulet that I couldn't remember. It wasn't just jewelry. Suddenly, something strange happened. The forest around me began to change its outlines, and the ground began to tremble. I felt the air become thick, as if something invisible filled the space. My hands were shaking, and my heart was beating faster and faster. I heard something approaching, footsteps, quiet and unclear, but still clear. I looked back, and there she was again. Em. She was standing a few meters away from me, but her face was now something I couldn't place. She wasn't the one I knew. This was something else. She didn't speak, but her presence was all-consuming. I felt her eyes piercing me, and in that moment it became clear to me. She was part of something far more terrible than I could have imagined. I stood up and started to walk away, not taking my eyes off her, but she didn't move. She stood there and stared, and in her eyes I saw not just emptiness, but an entire world. A world where there was no place for me, for us. It was a place where I was a stranger, where I did not belong. I took a step back, but the ground beneath my feet began to shake again. Darkness appeared around me again, and I knew that I could no longer go back. I couldn't remember what had happened, how I had ended up here, but one thing was clear. I had lost control. I was once again beyond what I could understand. M was part of that shadow, part of something that was taking away my perception, my reality. I closed my eyes trying to escape this nightmare. But when I opened them again, the forest was gone. Everything was gone, and I stood in emptiness again. I woke up, but it was not an ordinary awakening. My body, like my mind, was empty, devoid of feelings and thoughts. I was here, in my room, but the feeling of alienation did not leave me. This was not a place where I could simply relax and continue living as before. Everything had changed, and I knew that these changes were not accidental. They were a consequence of what had happened in the forest, when I was confronted with something I could not understand and something I could not control. Trying to get my thoughts in order, I got out of bed and went to the window. The sky was cloudy, covered in fog, just like the day it all began. This fog had always been a part of my world, but now it seemed unusual, something that hid something greater. Fragments of memories continued to flash through my head, but they did not add up to a complete picture. Everything I could remember was somehow distorted, elusive, as if I was trying to capture something that was constantly slipping away from my perception. I walked over to my desk and looked at the amulet I had found in the woods. It lay there, its shine beckoning me. I had seen the amulet before, but I hadn't known what it meant, how it related to what was happening. Now I knew it was a key to unlocking what had happened to my sister and what was happening to me. M had worn the amulet, and now I held it in my hands, feeling like something hidden in it was transmitting some information, some power. I took out my phone and opened the map to check what had happened the moment I had taken it from the woods. I tried to remember the road I had taken. I tried to understand why I hadn't noticed anything strange the moment I had driven there, why I hadn't realized that this place wasn't part of the city, wasn't familiar. I trusted my perception, but it had deceived me, and now I didn't know if I could trust anything I had experienced. I closed my eyes again and let the memories sink in. I remembered M standing in the dark, her eyes empty, how I felt something change when I looked into them. I didn't know then, at that moment, that those weren't just my sister's eyes. I didn't know that it wasn't her. It was someone else, someone who had taken on her appearance to confuse me, to make me believe what had happened that evening. My heart began to beat faster as I realized that this was all part of a plan I couldn't understand. Someone or something was manipulating me. I didn't know what it was, but now looking at the amulet, I felt like the moment had come to reveal the secret. M was part of this plan, but she wasn't the cause of it. She was part of a game I was being drawn into. I jumped up and headed for the door. I had to get back into the woods, but this time I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed to find someone who could help me understand what was happening, but who would be willing to help in a situation like this? Who would believe in what I had been through? I thought of my friend I had met that night when I picked up M. I knew he wouldn't take me seriously, but he was the only one who could have been there when it all happened. Maybe he had noticed something. Maybe he had seen something I hadn't. I dialed his number and heard his voice on the other end of the line. "Did you understand something?" I asked, not giving him time to ask questions. He was quiet for a few seconds before answering. "Something strange. You're not kidding, are you?" I couldn't explain it all to him. It was too complicated, too confusing to put into words. But I knew he was the only one who would be willing to believe me. And I knew that if we didn't solve this mystery, it would continue to follow us until we were in complete shadow. We met at the old church on the outskirts of town, where I thought this whole story began. The church seemed to hold the answers I needed. We stood before its gates, and I felt a cold wind blowing over me, like the fog was settling over the city again. "Do you believe this?" I asked, looking back at him. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw fear. Fear that was as real as mine. "I don't know what it is, but I'm ready to find out. Let's figure it out together." And there we stood, ready to face whatever lurked in this darkness that haunted us. We couldn't be sure that night that we would come back, but one thing was certain. We needed to understand what was behind it. And once we stepped into that fog, I knew that we couldn't return to the world that had come before. Story 2. Karaoke nights are always something special. Not like in clubs where the volume is blaring and people just get drunk on the music. Here in our club, everything is much simpler. People come to relax, chat with friends, and maybe sing along at some point. I work a lot on the side, as most of us do. Sometimes you can't support yourself with one-day job, and karaoke in the club has become something of a stable supplement for me. It's not so bad, really. I love the atmosphere. I love those moments when you can stand on stage and sing something for yourself. But as much as I love this place, every week I face the same problems. I stood at the microphone trying to calm the crowd, which seemed to be growing more impatient with each passing minute. It was past midnight, and the club was starting to empty a little. Some of the patrons had gone out for a smoke. Others were sitting in corners, lost in their phones. But those who remained were still waiting for their moment. I was sure that soon everyone would be back, and we could continue the evening. Everything was going as usual. Technical problems are standard. A couple of people were rushing me to be next. Someone didn't give an answer, although a minute ago they literally begged to take their turn. A cycle of usual karaoke problems, in which, in principle, there is nothing new. I was even glad that the evening did not give itself away by anything special. I liked ordinary evenings, where nothing extraordinary happens. At such moments, I felt confident, because there was nothing that could throw me off track. When I showed up at the club at 9, I knew right away that it was going to be a quiet night. That meant I could get a few songs in. There are those nights when there are no crowds and you can just belt out your favorite tracks without worrying about who's going to come on stage or when. My standard set was ready. I knew what to do. All that was left was to get into my work and make the night enjoyable for those who were still there. And so it all went. The first song is the standard My Way. Another respectable man on stage, all in a suit with a beard as he thought, giving him solidity. The second is Piano Man. I saw how tired the audience was, but still supported the participants. By this time, I already knew that something unusual was about to happen, and not because I had a premonition. It just came with every step, with every moment when I thought about what I had to do. And so it was. The moment I noticed him wasn't all that special at first glance. He simply walked into the club like any other person and headed towards the bar. There was nothing foreboding about trouble, and yet his appearance changed the atmosphere. He wasn't the kind of person I would have immediately noticed if he had just walked past, but something about him caught my attention. It took me a while to figure out what it was. Maybe it was the way he moved, or the strange look he gave me as he walked in. All I knew was that this wasn't the kind of person who just walked into a club to listen to music and have a few drinks. I was busy when he wrote down his request on the sheet of paper, but I still noticed that his song was written in a strange way. Usually, all karaoke requests are done quickly and easily. The name of the song and the artist, and you're ready, but not with him. His song looked like it was a random combination of letters, and the artist was written as some kind of set of symbols that I had trouble even reading. The sheet of paper contained only meaningless combinations of letters. And it didn't seem like a mistake. He clearly knew what he was doing when he wrote those symbols. I looked at him again. He was standing at the bar talking to the bartender, but there was something odd about his figure. He was of average height with casually styled blonde hair and dark eyes. He had a light goatee and was wearing a plain black t-shirt and faded jeans. I remembered that he also had a large tattoo on his left forearm, but in the dim light of the club, I couldn't quite make out the details. It was bright enough to catch my eye, but not so bright that I could tell exactly what it depicted. Without thinking, I took his order and went to my console. And that was the first moment that made me think that this would not be an ordinary evening. It all started with this strange piece of paper and his songs that did not fit into the usual framework. The club had its own dynamics, which suddenly began to be violated. It was like some kind of sign, and maybe everything I felt then was intuitive, but I certainly could not explain what exactly made me think that way. I walked up to the remote and started searching for a song, pointing at the screen. Instrumental tracks, the usual searches, but when I typed in what he'd written, the screen showed nothing. All that appeared was a sentence. "You might like this." I tried again and failed again. He stood there unfazed, and I heard him quietly repeat his instructions. "Type it exactly as I wrote it. It should be as is." Only when I finally got the combination right did the screen show a single video. It was a result I hadn't expected. When I finally chose the right song, the club became quieter, although the music continued to play, and the people sitting at the tables continued to whisper. But there was a strange heaviness in the air. I looked at the screen and saw a video clip appear on the screen. It was not what I expected. Not the old karaoke with eternal hits, but something completely different. The picture was blurry, the colors were floating, and some strange, almost mystical atmosphere arose. On the screen there was a silhouette flickering in the darkness, outlined by a dim light. It was a man standing surrounded by dark, moldy walls, almost like from a nightmare. I quickly looked away, unable to understand what was happening. What kind of video was this? I looked back at the man standing at the bar. He was not looking at the screen as I expected. He just stood there, leaning against the bar counter, and seemed so calm, as if everything that was happening was part of something long familiar. Then I knew I had to do something. I went to the remote to stop the video clip, but something made me pause. The screen didn't respond to my attempts. My fingers couldn't find the right button. This strange feeling of confusion came over me. I still couldn't believe that this was actually happening. I looked at the man again. He hadn't moved. His face remained impassive, as if he was prepared for what was happening around him. Something about this song was wrong. I could feel it. Time dragged on, but everything around me changed. I began to hear something strange, almost elusive, muffled sounds, as if somewhere in the club something was moving, pulling me along. The sounds were not from the reality I was used to, and then I felt this man's gaze. He was looking straight at me. There was nothing familiar in his eyes, no interest, nothing human. I couldn't look away. He raised an eyebrow slightly as if inviting me to take the next step, but I didn't know what to do. It all started with his recording, the strange set of letters, and now this song, this video of the man who had been watching me the whole time. Something in his gaze made me feel like I wasn't just playing a role in the club, that something much darker was actually happening. He knew something I didn't. My fingers were shaking. I was trying to interact with the remote again, but now the image on the screen began to change. It became more distinct. At first it was a dark room. Then a light appeared, weak, dim, like from a candle. Gradually I began to discern the outlines of figures standing in the semi-darkness. They were moving, but not like people. These were movements that seemed too fluid, too unnatural, as if they did not have real bodies. Their movements were as if in some strange, eclipsed reality. I felt my heart beat faster, and my breath came in short gasps. Suddenly I realized I was no longer standing at the controls. I was somewhere far away from them. How did I get here? Everything around me had changed. The wooden floor of the club had been replaced with dark tiles. The ceiling was low and sagging, and the walls were covered with something viscous, black. There were distant whispers, as if someone was nearby. But even though I couldn't see their faces, I knew they were watching me. I quickly turned around and saw him again. The man. He was standing next to me, not moving. He was so close I could smell his skin. He knew no fear. He was calm, and again I felt the cold seeping into my bones. There was no usual brightness in his eyes, no joy, no regret, only emptiness. You understand what's happening, don't you? His voice was quiet, but I clearly heard every word, as if he was speaking directly into my ear. I froze. Everything inside me protested, but I couldn't answer. He knew more than I did, and I was afraid. He came even closer. Now I felt his presence not only next to me, but inside me, as if his words and his gaze penetrated deeper than just physical contact. I tried to get to my feet, but something held me in place, like an invisible force. I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. He spoke again. You can't leave until you understand what's happening. You're already a part of it. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could utter a word, the space around me began to distort. Everything suddenly became cloudy and foggy, sounds merged into a single mass, and the light faded. I tried to take a step, but I was pulled back, as if something invisible was taking me into the dark depths. A bright spot flashed before my eyes, and I felt myself being enveloped by something. The strange club with its karaoke and people was gone, replaced by something completely different. It was a place I had never been before, but which now felt familiar. When I came to, it was too late. Everything around me had disappeared, as if I had woken up from some strange nightmare, but could not separate it from reality. The dark walls I had seen before dissolved, and the club, with its noisy customers and neon lights, seemed to have disappeared, leaving only silence. I stood in an empty room that I could not recognize. Around me were only the remains of something long forgotten. The floor was covered in dust. In some places there were traces of something old, lost, as if no human had set foot here for a long time. The wooden beams, as if succumbing to time, had rotted, and I realized that this place had long been abandoned. It felt like time had stopped here. My fingers felt cold as I ran my hand along one of the beams. It was covered in a layer of black film, as if no one had touched it for a long time. I tried to focus on what was happening. Where was I? How did I get here? Questions were ringing in my head, but I couldn't answer them. The answers were as far away as everything else in this strange place. I took a step forward and immediately noticed a dim light flickering somewhere in the corner of the room. It was an old rusty light fixture hanging from the ceiling, barely illuminating the space around me. My gaze was drawn to a small door, barely visible in the darkness. I didn't know what could be there, but everything in me told me that I had to go there. There was a feeling inside me that the more I avoided it, the harder it would be to find answers to what was happening. With every step into the darkness, I felt the air become thicker, as if every molecule in it was trying to hold me in place. The emptiness around me began to press. I was sure I heard sounds, but they were too hard to discern. They were subtle, like footsteps that someone was trying to hide, as if something was following me. Maybe it was just my thoughts playing tricks on me, but I felt like something was wrong in this place. As I approached the door, I felt a strange pressure in my chest. It wasn't painful, but it was strong. I opened the door without thinking about the consequences and found myself in a small corridor where the air was even thicker. The shadows on the walls seemed alive. They moved, stirred, as if they were influenced by invisible hands. I couldn't understand what exactly I was seeing, but it was too obvious to ignore. I continued forward, even though everything inside me was screaming at me to stop, that this wasn't where I was supposed to be. But there was no way to turn back. I was already here, and it seemed I was about to find out what this place was and why it was causing me such anxiety. At the end of the hallway was another door, no different from the last one, but this time, it seemed to glow with some strange light. It wasn't the usual light I would expect from a light bulb, or the light coming through the windows. This light was coming from within, as if the room itself was filled with something that shouldn't be there. I opened the door and another room appeared before me. There were several tables on it, on which lay old books, parchments, and strange metal objects. They did not look like they belonged to this era. These objects were too ancient to be part of modern life, and at the same time they looked almost like forgotten artifacts. I walked closer, examining the things on one of the tables. One of the objects caught my attention. It was a small metal box covered in dust and rust. It had strange symbols carved into it that I could not recognize. I tried to open it, but the lid did not budge. Apparently, it was sealed somehow, perhaps long ago, to prevent anyone from opening it. Then I felt the gaze return to me, the same gaze I had noticed when I was in the club. I turned around, but there was no one there, only emptiness. My fingers went pale, and suddenly I realized that this feeling was not just a figment of my imagination. Someone was really watching me. I turned and looked at the walls of the room. Now I realized that they were covered in the same strange symbols as the box. It was like an invitation, like footprints that led me to something much greater than I could have imagined. I took a step back and pulled my phone out of my pocket, trying to find a signal, but there was none. All I could get was silence. The world around me had swallowed up all possibility of choice. It seemed I was trapped with no way out. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror that hung on the wall, reflecting the same empty room I was in. It was strange that it didn't show me. Not my reflection, not even my shadow. Just empty glass, dimly shining in the darkness. It seemed unnatural, as if instead of a normal reflection, it was absorbing the light, leaving everything around me in an even more obscurantist state. I moved closer, feeling the air become cooler than it had been before. The dark corners of the room were becoming increasingly oppressive. When I touched the surface of the mirror, it was cold, almost icy, as if there was an entity within it that did not tolerate being touched. My fingers paused on the glass for a moment, and then I felt them begin to vibrate faintly, as if the mirror was trying to reflect something more than just me. I stepped back, feeling a strange uneasiness in my chest. It continued to grow until it became almost unbearable. Something about this place was not like the real world. Everything seemed distorted, as if I were somewhere between worlds. Not the one where people lived, and not the one where creatures from misty legends dwelled. My mind was racing, unsure of what to make of it all. Where was I? Why me? Why was I being drawn to this place despite my best efforts to avoid the answer? It was a torturous feeling, as if I knew something was about to happen, but I couldn't escape it. I returned to the door I had entered through. Trying to find a way out, I found it locked. I tried to open it several times, but to no avail. The feeling of confinement grew, and I felt the walls slowly begin to move, as if someone invisible was trying to make this place impossibly narrow. Soon I noticed strange sounds, quiet and unusual. They could be compared to rustlings, unnatural and ringing, as if someone was whispering behind my back. I looked around, but saw no one. Only dust and shadows. The sounds continued. They became louder and clearer. I tried to concentrate, but the feeling that I was being followed only grew stronger. Gradually, I realized that the sounds were not coming from outside, but from inside the room itself. And not just rustlings, but footsteps. Many footsteps that echoed off the walls. I listened, but I could not understand where they were coming from. They were getting closer and closer, and suddenly I realized that I was not alone. I turned back to the mirror. It was no longer empty. In the reflection, I saw a figure standing right behind me, tall, thin, almost ghostly. Her entire form was blurred, but I could clearly see her eyes. Their light was cold and piercing, as if they were looking right through me. At that moment, I froze. It was impossible to turn away from that gaze, impossible to run. But I felt fear slowly creeping into me as that figure began to drain all my resolve. I realized that she wasn't just there. She was a part of this place, and maybe a part of me. I took a step back, tripping over something on the floor, and suddenly the room was filled with sounds again. They weren't just footsteps, but voices. Deep, old voices that pulled me back into dark corners I didn't want to go into. Voices that tried to speak to me, but I couldn't understand their language. It was as if the words had been forgotten, like ancient spells that were no longer meant to be spoken. And then I realized that the mirror was more than just a reflection. It was a portal, not a literal mirror, but a portal through which one could see not only present events, but also those that had long been forgotten. The mirror was a door to the past, perhaps even to other worlds. I felt its magic penetrate me, filling every corner of my mind. In an instant, I saw that I was standing in a different place. It was the same corridor I had been in, but now it looked completely different. It was lit by torches, and the air was thick with the smell of ancient wood and dust. It seemed that I had found myself in the past, in something long forgotten. Suddenly, I felt a shadow appear behind me. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a familiar sensation, as if someone had come too close, and now this shadow was watching my every step. I turned around and saw it again. It was close. I froze, not knowing what to do next. My hand barely held the door, but it seemed like I couldn't move away from it. The shadow standing behind me didn't move, but its presence became stronger. My breathing became heavy, and my chest seemed to compress with each new step I took in this unnatural space. The door I was trying to open wasn't just locked. I could feel its weight pulling me back, as if invisibly. Trying to leave this place was pointless. The door was growing heavier, as if the very structure of the world was resisting my efforts. I tried turning the handle again, but the resistance was so strong that my hands began to ache. Suddenly, with a growing sense of unease, I realized that the door was not just closed, but sealed by something older than I could comprehend. I looked back. The shadow was still there, but now it was moving. Its steps were light, barely audible, but there was some hidden threat in them. I knew that if I went there, back, I would not be able to return. This entity, this shadow that I felt inside me, in my veins, was connected to me. I felt it with every cell of my body. Nevertheless, I still took a step forward. It was hard to believe that it was me who was here, but still I moved forward, into the darkness, into the heart of this mystical shadow. I understood that I could no longer stay in this place. I could not wait and watch as everything around me slowly disappeared. I needed answers. I had to understand what happened next. And, as scary as it sounded, I had to find a way to break this vicious circle. With every step I took, I felt the walls begin to move. They seemed to be standing still, but it seemed to me that they were changing somehow. The space around me seemed to be stretching, and I couldn't understand what was happening to this world. Everything was becoming somehow alien, unknown, and I felt the tension growing. The air was cold, almost frosty. There were no windows or doors in the room, only this strange feeling that I had ended up in some intermediate place, where neither time nor space existed in the usual sense. I continued walking, not understanding why. Footsteps followed me. They rushed after me, quiet but distinct, as if someone knew exactly where I was going. With each new step, I felt myself losing touch with reality, how I could no longer distinguish where the end of this place was and where it began. I tried to concentrate, but nothing helped. When I finally reached the end of the corridor, I saw another door in front of me. It was different, strange. It didn't have the usual hinges or handle. It was just a door arch that led into an even more obscurantist space. My fingers closed around an invisible handle, although it was only imaginary, and I pushed it. The door swung open with a quiet, almost indistinct sound, as if the whole world froze at that moment. A faint flicker of light came from within. There behind the door was an image. A figure, someone watching me. It was the same image I had seen in the mirror, but now it was not just a reflection. It was something more real. It was not just a shadow. It was something I could not understand, but felt with my whole soul. There was a figure standing before me, tall and thin, its eyes empty, and everything around it seemed to have gone dark. It was moving, not running, but moving slowly and smoothly. as if the air around it was becoming thick and viscous. I felt the dark forces of this entity trying to pull me into its world. The fear was so strong that I even stopped breathing. It seemed to me that its presence in this place suppressed everything I knew about reality. I felt forces I couldn't control begin to pull me toward that image. I didn't know what she wanted from me, but intuitively I knew that if I got too close, I wouldn't be able to return. I stood at the threshold and that door was the only way out, but I wasn't sure it would take me where I wanted to be. With every movement of her figure, I felt something change in the air. She was getting closer, and I stood there, unable to move. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I felt this world beginning to fall apart. I didn't know how much time had passed, but as I stood before this figure, I felt reality losing its clarity. The place where I was began to blur into a fog, and the figure became more and more tangible, as if it were part of something larger that was hidden in the depths of this strange emptiness. I tried to understand what was happening, but my thoughts were confused, as if someone was deliberately blocking all attempts to comprehend what was happening. Her gaze was invisible, but I felt it, like a cold touch, piercing me through. With each step of this entity, I felt how every certainty that I could return at all disappears. There was a feeling that this place was not just space. It was something that could be perceived as a border between worlds. This corridor, this door, everything was an interweaving of unknown forces. The shadow continued to move slowly, as if enjoying every step. Suddenly, somehow, I was not where I had been a second ago. Everything around me had changed. I was in another room, another reality, and the same image stood before me. But now it was closer. I saw its face, or rather what replaced it. It was not human, but rather ineffable, as if the human form simply covered something ancient and unknown. This creature was not evil. It was not good. It was simply there, like an inevitability, like a shadow hiding the truth. My memory was starting to come back, like blocked memories were starting to surface, and I remembered moments when I was a child. Those moments seemed so far away, but now in this place, they were becoming real. Memories of running around the old house, of my parents talking about something important that I couldn't understand, started to surface. I remembered their conversations, their anxiety when they said that I was destined for something. But what did that mean? I didn't know, and now, standing before this image, I knew I had no choice. I was here for a reason I couldn't explain. But I felt this moment was important, and all my doubts were disappearing. I didn't know how it would end, but I knew I had to find out. The figure in front of me took another step, and now there was a door in front of me, almost like the one I had once walked through, only now it was open. I wanted to step through it, but I held back, because it wasn't that easy. I knew that if I took that step, I would never be able to go back. This was a one-way street. I knew the answer I was looking for was behind that door, but what was waiting for me there? Perhaps this was my last chance to understand what was happening. Perhaps it was a trap I could never escape from. I stood at a crossroads. Should I act or wait? But waiting, I knew, was even worse than stepping into the unknown. Finally, I took a step into the darkness. The moment I crossed the threshold, the feeling that I would never return overwhelmed me. I felt the door close behind me, and instantly I knew that there was no turning back. Something ringing like a heartbeat filled the air. And then something completely different appeared before me. This world behind the door was similar to the one I lived in, but it was distorted. Everything around me was changed, as if time was playing with me, and reality was shifting in a strange direction. It was something inhuman. With every step through this space, I felt my mind continue to tear apart. Fragments of phrases emerged in my memory. You are chosen. You must go this way. Everything you have done so far has been preparation. But preparation for what? I did not know. I kept walking, hoping that answers would one day be found, that this strange road would lead me to the truth. But now, as I stood in this changed world, I knew one thing. Whatever lay ahead, I was already part of something much larger than I could have imagined. The world around me continued to change, as if the air itself was alive, and every breath made me feel like reality was becoming more and more shaky. I continued to walk as if without a final destination, only intuitively feeling that my steps were supposed to lead me somewhere, where I did not know, and this feeling of uncertainty became heavier with each step. I remember that moment in the club when at first I hadn't paid attention to the oddities. Dis's appearance had been a minor detail, something small, not worthy of special attention. But now I saw how that evening had become a turning point, after which everything I knew took on a new form. His song, his words, his request to stay in the box. None of it had been accidental. I increasingly felt like I had become part of something much older and more dangerous. Now, in this strange place, I found it difficult to separate my thoughts from the feeling that I was not simply searching for answers. I was drawn into something greater, something that was playing with my expectations and fears. This world before me was somehow alive. The walls seemed to breathe, as if the very space around me was trying to tell me something. I felt every particle of air fill with this oppressive sense of the unknown. Soon a figure appeared in front of me. It stood in the shadows, but now I knew that it was not just a shadow, but something that took shape when I looked at it. I did not know what it was, but the feeling of its presence was familiar. It was the same image I had seen in the club, a mysterious shadow, a figure that was at the center of everything, but still remained ineffable. Do you understand everything? Her voice was not a voice, but rather a vibration, as if she were transmitting a thought directly to my head. I could not answer with words, because words had lost all meaning here, but I knew that she was waiting for my answer. I nodded, although I was not sure that I really understood. Rather, I just continued to feel that all of this had some meaning, something much greater than I could imagine. She took a step forward, and I felt the space around me change. Everything around me began to darken, as if I were in absolute shadow. The shadow was not just the absence of light, it was tangible, like a living thing. I felt my feet moving heavily in the shadow, as if it was pulling me into its abyss. You were a part of this, the figure continued, its words echoing in my mind. And now you must decide what you will do with it. You cannot go back, but you can become what you were always meant to be. You were chosen. Chosen. The word rang in my head like a death sentence. I knew none of this had been an accident. My name, Dis, the club, his request. It was as if it had all been leading me to this point. I was a part of something unimaginable, something beyond my understanding. You wanted to know who I am? The figure continued. I am Dis, but not who you thought I was. I am your shadow. You are my light side. We are one. Only you must understand how it works. I knew I had to understand now, but the understanding was heavy, like a burden. Dis was not just a man. He was the embodiment of something deeper than I could imagine. He was a part of me, a part of something that existed in another time and place. At that moment, everything around me suddenly disappeared, and I found myself in emptiness. I no longer felt like I was standing on the ground. I was free and at the same time imprisoned in this vast space that was not bound by physical laws. It was heaven, but not as I knew it. It was heaven in a completely different dimension. There I stood, and the figure of Dis appeared again. He was formless now, but I knew he was there. There was no longer that strange song of his, that vocal influence that penetrated my thoughts. We were equals now, or maybe it was I who had changed. He looked the same as before, but I knew that now I could understand him, and he could understand me. You will decide what to do with this, both of us, and it does not matter what happens next. All steps lead here. My breathing became even, and I felt how this world around me began to shrink. All the doors, all the paths, everything that seemed unknown were before me. I stood at a crossroads, but there was no longer fear. There was only understanding. I knew that the path I had chosen was not easy, but now I was ready.